You're listening to Why We Do What We Do. Welcome to Why We Do What We Do. I am your liberated host, Abraham.
And I am your bald eagle host, Shane.
We are a psychology podcast.
And we are so free.
And we're so free. We also use a lot of comedy and science to drive our message of science and comedy, and it works, I tell you.
Effective. It is very effective.
We talk about all sorts of psychology things. Today, we're talking about something that I think I've been long wanting to talk about, and that is like, how do we scientifically and psychologically unpack freedom and what that is?
Mm-hmm.
And tangentially, I guess, in that realm, liberty.
So as we were putting together the notes for this one, I realized how difficult that was to do.
Yeah.
There's a lot of, I don't want to call it gray area, but there are a lot of spaces where you can find yourself in a slippery slope. And we're going to talk about some of that stuff too. But it is a really interesting concept because it's so much more nuanced than people give it credit for.
Now, we will talk about some ways that you can support the show. If you would like to help us do the things that we do, you can always subscribe, leave us a rating and review, buy some merch, sign up for Patreon. I'm going to talk more about that at the end of the episode, but I would like to actually kick off this discussion by reading a quote. Can I do that? Is that cool?
Yes, please do. Please do. I'm going to light some candles, and when you're done, we'll do the beatnik snap.
Thanks. Just ruffling my pages here. Okay.
Because we believe in real books.
I'm not going to try and do an impression because I wouldn't know how, but this is from B.F. Skinner talking here about freedom, because that's what we're doing. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to quote him here. Quote, "Feeling free is an important hallmark of a kind of control distinguished by the fact that it does not breed counter-control." And I really like that statement. It's going to come back around. I'm going to say it one more time. Ready?
Mm-hmm.
Quote, "Feeling free is an important hallmark of a kind of control distinguished by the fact that it does not breed counter-control." End quote. And this is from About Behaviorism.
Good book.
Yeah, one of his later books, published in 1974. Not super late, obviously. He went on to publish many more things up into the 80s. And even shortly before he passed in 1991. I believe it was 91, right?
I think it was somewhere around there.
Yeah.
Early 90s.
Yeah.
Right around when Guns N' Roses was at their peak.
That's right. Still around, but
Still around.
Peak 3 decades ago.
Peak. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's what we're doing. Shane put these notes together. Great job. And I'm looking forward to talking about this. We should start probably by defining our terms, yeah?
Yeah, so we're going to try to answer what freedom is, and I think the best place to start is with a definition. So freedom is defined as, quote, "the power or right to act, speak, or think as one wants without hindrance or restraint," end quote. And a lot of different definitions are out there, and it'll talk about the absence of subjection to foreign domination or despotic government. It'll talk about the state of not being imprisoned or enslaved. There's a lot of different ways to describe this, and there are a lot of different nuances to it, but we're going to go with the main definition, which is that power or right to act, speak, or think as one wants without hindrance or restraint.
Another way of thinking about freedom is the absence of subjugation to foreign domination or to a despotic government, which is also something that's important and we'll come back around to. Interestingly, despotic governments have recently learned that they can be despots, mm-hmm. that they're tyrants, and that their authoritarian leaders tell their citizens that they're not, and then people just believe them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, isn't that weird how that happens?
I mean, it's kind of like classic abusers where they're like, they're abusing their victims and saying this is your fault, right?
Right.
And then some people just start to believe that that's true. As sad and terrible as that is exactly how I feel about authoritarian despotic governments, that it's really, really sad that they can be despots and ruling their people with an iron fist and have people think that that's not only okay, but ultimately a good thing. It's extremely depressing.
Yeah, it's real bad.
Yeah.
And the other point too, that we talked about the state of being imprisoned or not being imprisoned or enslaved. I feel like that's a pretty good black and white example of like, I'm not under somebody's control. I am free to move about a space that is around me without any sort of restraints like jail bars or anything like that. I think that's something that is going to come back around a little bit too when we discuss why people lose the freedom of movement or why they end up in imprisoned or enslaved spaces.
And we will get back around to this definition when we start talking about the sort of behavior science view of freedom. But to quote Skinner again here, he says, quote, "Freedom usually means the absence of restraint or coercion, but more comprehensively, it means a lack of any prior determination. All things that come to be except acts of will have causes," end quote.
There you go.
Same book.
Same book. Good book about behaviorism. Go check it out.
Yeah.
So based on the definitions that we just gave and kind of those minor points, there are 3 ways that we can start looking at this. Freedom being, I'm free to do what I want. Freedom being, no government is telling me what to do. And freedom being, I'm not jailed or controlled by another person, right? So if we kind of like have that general theme as we go forward, you'll see as some of these other areas, as we talk about them, really come back to one of these things. I can do what I want. I don't have anybody controlling my behavior or telling me what to do in a particular context, and I'm not jailed or controlled by another person.
Yes, important. And those are, maybe they sound really similar, but there are some subtle differences about them that we'll get to. Mm-hmm. The next term here, of course, that we've already mentioned is liberty and what that means. And this is, quote, the state of being free within society from oppressive restrictions imposed by authority on one's way of life, behavior, or political views, end quote. And this is one where we're going to come back around to talking about what that kind of means, because there is not liberty, like unrestricted liberty. All of it comes with certain amounts of restriction. And that is still with like, I think you just can't have unrestricted liberty. Mm-hmm. That would look like chaos. And maybe we'll talk about that more. Not maybe, it'll happen.
Yeah, it'll for sure happen. And I think this is a term that's come up a whole lot lately.
For sure.
And we've talked about this in like, our vaccines episodes. And we talked about this in some other episodes too, to talk about this type of thing. And the idea is just kind of, it's really interesting to get into because like Abraham just mentioned, there is not really a space where there is just unhindered liberty. Like nobody is just free and so free that they couldn't be freer. That's not how it works. It would be absolute chaos. But so we are not going to, for the rest of this episode, hinder ourselves or restrain ourselves to those singular definitions. We are going to talk about some specific aspects of freedom though as we go, and we are going to really kind of like expound upon why each of these unique freedoms are going to be really important.
Exactly. And additionally, we feel it necessary to remind listeners that the Why We Do What We Do crew currently lives in the United States. Mm-hmm. And that's where we're from, where the ideas of freedom and liberty are embedded in any discussion about our culture, although we might not be as free as we think, and we might be freer than we think in some circumstances as well.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a common saying that is, quote, my freedom to swing my fist stops at your nose. And we're going to talk about what that means as well, because I think that is something that's often misconstrued in the discussion of freedom and liberty, is that people think that they can kind of do whatever they want to do, but there are consequences for behaviors. So we're going to really get into that as well. Yeah,
essentially saying like, I can do what I want to do until it impinges on someone else. Right. Like, or on their freedom specifically, and what that kind of means, because you start to get in murky gray water really quickly, but people will commonly cite this and say like, well, this is my freedom. I have freedom to make this choice for myself. I mean, yeah, but the choice for yourself affects everyone else around you. Right. And so that's why it's like, just because you're not directly punching me in the face doesn't mean that like, this isn't profoundly affecting my ability to move and get around in the world and otherwise have freedom and equal access to things. So that is an important thing to come back to probably.
Yeah. And we're going to come back to that several times as we talk about this.
Yeah.
So within the subject of freedom, there are several areas that we want to discuss just briefly, but I think it's important because it gives a little bit of nuance to the discussion of freedom. The reason we have this broken up into these areas has to do with the unique aspects of freedom that go along with these specific topics. And as we explore these areas, hopefully that will become more apparent as we kind of really dive into these unique areas of freedom.
So we'll talk about some academic freedom, artistic freedom, intellectual freedom, economic freedom, political freedom, religious freedom, all kinds of so much freedom. That word.
So much freedom?
Yeah, we're so free. I feel like the word freedom and liberty are going to start to sound pretty meaningless.
Yeah.
Which maybe that's appropriate for this conversation.
Yeah, that's totally fair.
So let's start by tackling some academic freedom.
Academic freedom focuses on freedom of inquiry and education. Essentially, this boils down to the ability to teach and communicate ideas and facts without oppression or imprisonment. So I want to really harp on this part of it. This talks about the idea of freedom of inquiry and freedom of education. And, you'll hear people talk about like, too much education or you'll hear people talk about indoctrination in higher education and stuff like that. We're not going to get into all the conspiracy theories around that. This essentially says that we are allowed to ask questions. We have the freedom to ask questions, and we have the freedom to an education that will enhance our knowledge about the world around us.
Now, I love the way that you also set this up. So shout out to you and how you arrange these notes, because in every one of these, you have this really important distinction here of freedom to access to something and freedom from restriction of in some way, right?
Right.
And so inside of this academic freedom, the two key factors I think to consider are there's freedom to share information ideas coupled with there is a guarantee or there should be some allowance for freedom from oppression or oppressors attempting to suppress those ideas.
Yeah.
And so there's sort of that two-way street there is not only do I have the freedom to share these ideas that I have, but I also have the freedom to not be oppressed, I guess, in my attempting to even have those ideas in the first place or teach them to someone else.
Yeah. One thing you'll find within academic freedom is scientific freedom, which it's often embedded in this within academic freedom because of the inquiry component. It is a form of inquiry about kind of the phenomenon in the world around us. And so as we start looking at academic freedom, scientific freedom is very closely, if not entirely, embedded underneath this. Now, within this space, there are protections, some restrictions that are designed to reduce harm specifically. So you've got IRBs, you've got review boards, you've got human rights and stuff like that. And as a quick recommendation, you should go read the Black Science comic because that definitely tells you where scientific freedom can go horribly, horribly wrong across an entire multiverse.
Fun.
It is so good, but it also tells you like, hey, maybe there's protections in place for a reason.
Wow. Okay. Curiosity is piqued.
I think you would really like it, actually.
Yeah.
I think you would really like Black Science.
It does kind of sound, it sounds like sort of familiar territory to me in terms of things that I'd normally be interested in exploring. So I get that.
100%.
All right. So we're talking about this academic freedom. And I think a really important thing, like let's get philosophical and epistemological here. What does this kind of freedom mean with respect to spreading harmful disinformation? Because I feel like you could have a place of claimed to be academic or academic training in some sort, where they are really clearly sharing ideas that are demonstrably false, potentially harmful, sometimes actively harmful, and claim like I have a freedom to share these ideas, right?
Yeah.
And we've basically just laid out the fact that that is a freedom that they might have depending on where they're at, right? And that would also mean freedom from people suppressing those ideas. And so what's the solution there, right? What does that mean?
Some clear examples of where academic freedom can go horribly wrong is with people like Andrew Wakefield, who are sharing a lot of disinformation about a particular type of intervention that is actively harmful. And when you really look at this piece, like he will make the argument, I have a freedom to say this, I have a freedom to share this information, but there is that point where it's like, to what degree do you say, no, you can't share that information anymore because what you're doing is hurting a large group of vulnerable people. You see examples of this where harmful disinformation is coming out a lot in academics, right? Ivermectin is an example of one that has come out several times, and now people are turning into horses, and it's ridiculous. We talked about this in the pseudoscience episode when we debunked different pseudosciences and stuff like that. When we really get into it, sometimes sharing that harmful disinformation, really, truly, it does talk about this, to what degree, what's the line with this type of academic inquiry, academic education, and this academic freedom overall.
First of all, people turning into horses, I had a joke in my mind about it being I Am Little Pony instead of My Little Pony, which I think is fun.
Yeah.
But going back to this, like to try and make this, I think, palpable, because I'm trying to think of like, what is a topic that most people in the United States would feel like this is egregiously inappropriate, right? And mostly I was thinking like, okay, if there was a teacher in a classroom in school spreading the idea of like the flat earth, I don't know if that is controversial enough for the United States, given where we're at in this world where anything goes. But maybe if it was something like, I'm going to go just real extreme hyperbolic here to try and help make a point, which is like, what if there was a teacher who was promoting the idea that we should amputate or we remove the eyeballs of all new children as they come into the school? And like, just an idea I've got, I should be able to express my idea and why that would be problematic, right? And I think that that is where we start asking the question. And again, we're not necessarily making a claim on a position on anything, although with that one, I will say I'm hard against. But as far as freedom goes, like, do they have the freedom to spread those ideas? Is that something that they should have the right to do? And is that something that is considered free by allowing that platform to give them a voice?
I think a real life example that we can point to is with Dr. Mengele during World War II. Like, talk about unhindered scientific freedom, essentially, that he had at Auschwitz, right? And in the horrible experiments that he was conducting and the horrible things that he did to people. That is an example of where there should clearly be a line. Yeah. Where the inquiry has bled into, this is no longer inquiry, this is actively harmful for people. And that would be an example of, problematic, really horrible science. there are examples in history where this can go horribly wrong.
Yeah. Maybe another one I had, I guess, was like, if a teacher was promoting, yours was a really good example for scientific freedom, and I was sort of going with like scholastic freedom, if you will, in like a school setting. What if there was like a teacher who's promoting the idea of like, don't ever wear seatbelts. Seatbelts are terrible, right?
Yeah.
And like they're sort of saying like, well, I have the freedom to express these ideas. And the thing is, like, even though you could counter by saying, well, we're just going to teach the opposite of that in other places, the problem is with some of those, like once the idea is in there and takes hold, like there are going to be some people who are now no longer susceptible to the sort of counter programming, if you will, of correct information, which is that seatbelts ultimately save many people's lives and are the right way to go. And so the fact that they're pushing that idea comes with a cost, a pretty substantial cost, and also then makes the job of like basic human safety a lot harder.
Absolutely.
All right. Now is the time to have the freedom to let these other companies have the freedom to sell you things that you're then free to buy or not.
And then you're free to skip ahead if you want to.
True. Okay, so we impinged on your freedom by making you listen to those ads, and I'm sorry, but we're back.
We are back.
And we're now, so we've been talking about types of freedom, and the next type of freedom is artistic freedom, which I think also is kind of a hot topic in the United States and maybe around the world.
For sure. I mean, to the degree that people are put to death over artistic freedom.
Yeah.
Artistic freedom refers to the ability to share and create diverse works of art without censorship. And this is a really fascinating, I think, nuanced area of freedom that I think is a lot of fun to talk about in the United States, because especially with people getting so offended by certain artwork and stuff, I think it's really, really interesting.
Yeah, for sure. This has been around for a long time. We've talked about book burnings, right? As a sort of an example of this. Mm-hmm. Is there freedom in that? Or banned books from libraries, also important.
Right.
So in some instances, artistic freedom is intertwined with political freedom, which makes a lot of sense given, and I just mentioned some examples, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. But the ability to produce works of art that are politically charged are not as dangerous in the United States as maybe some parts of the country. However, there are some countries where speaking out politically can result in severe reaction at the government level, such as incarceration, and historically put to death or otherwise like severely maimed.
Yeah. So I want to talk about a specific example. There is a band which also has one of the greatest band names in the world. This band is called Pussy Riot. And if you've never heard of this band, they are a Russian punk band that does extensive art, kind of like protest pieces. And it's like they're a very expressive band. They have an extensive protest history, and they do a lot of protest or performance art. 5 members of the band were arrested in 2012 for, quote, hooliganism in Russia. And so for context, the band will often play what they call unauthorized guerrilla gigs in public places. So for this particular incident that they got arrested for, they set up and played a show in the Cathedral of Christ the Savior in protest of Putin's election in 2012. So this is kind of where this whole artistic freedom issue got started with them. Now,
apparently, they were sentenced to 2 years in prison for the performance, and Amnesty International identified them as, quote, prisoners of conscience, end quote. During their imprisonment, Nadia Tolokonikova went missing for a period of time and was later found in a Siberian gulag. So very scary stuff.
Yeah. This is essentially, somebody is in their prison system and then goes missing for months at a time, weeks and months at a time, where, her husband was not able to find her, not able to get in contact, no information or anything.
Jeez.
And so I think this is one of those things where it's like, in the United States, we have a lot of ability to express ourselves creatively without having a situation like this where we end up in a space where we're missing in a prison or in prison doing hard labor for performance pieces and whatnot. So, there is a question to unpack, which is, what does this mean in relation to disseminating creative works that celebrate and promote the idea of spreading real violence? And this is something that's come up in the United States more recently, specifically in maybe the Twitter sphere as well.
Yeah, I think art pieces can be used as propaganda. Mm-hmm. And I think ultimately something that's been implied in what we've been talking about is that ultimately we sort of view freedom as a good thing, right? Mm-hmm. And so when we are having these discussions, there's some nuance here about what does that mean and to what extent should it apply? Because we're ultimately in favor of freedom. And what does that mean when we take a look at something like, okay, we want to promote freedom of people to dissent in their artwork by saying like, this is something we oppose and then depicting it artistically in some way. And what that means is that we then have to be in support of it, being whether or not we're in agreement with it. But what about when it comes to the point where people start creating artwork that is, just as you said, promoting hate it is promoting bigotry, it is promoting attacking marginalized groups. If there was anti-Semitic art, if there was art that was promoting things like killing people who were in an opposition party. And this actually came up recently in the United States. I believe it was a senator who had posted some thing on social media, animated graphic depicting him killing a bunch of his colleagues on his political rivals. And I believe was censored for that. And I think, again, asking the question, like, should freedom guarantee the right to depict that kind of violence? If someone had seen that and been like, sweet, let's do it, and then they went after and then executed on that, would that person then be held accountable for that just because they put it out there? And if the reverse had happened, if someone like their political rival had made that animation and then someone had gone after that person and was violent, like, should we say that, no, they had the right to do that? And it's like, you just always have to consider it's a two-way street, right?
Yeah. And this is one that comes up a lot, specifically freedom of speech too, where it's like, to what degree are these rights protected, given that harm can come to people or people that are in public positions might share artwork that could unduly influence larger groups of people towards something like an insurrection, just as a hypothetical, or something to that degree. Like, there is that line where it's like, at what point in time does this become harmful? And that's not an easy question to answer.
And the question, should they be protected? And even, should they be considered freedoms? Right?
Right.
So I think that's a relevant question to ask here.
Yeah. So the next bit of freedom that we want to talk about is intellectual freedom. And I do like this. And as I was reading this section and kind of talking about this, I was thinking of, kind of just talking about freedoms in general. I don't know why 1984 just kept like ringing in my head.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh yeah, thought crimes came up when I talked about intellectual freedom. So intellectual freedom basically says that this is the freedom to disseminate and receive information without restriction. And this is specifically called intellectual freedom. I can share, we can generate ideas, we can have discussions.
Yeah.
And this type of freedom occurs outside of the academic context, where that focus is education. And here, intellectual freedom is embedded within society as the ability to freely share ideas. So this is outside of academic. This is kind of like an overarching social freedom. And
inside of this is where you're going to get some of the very specific types of freedom that we'll often hear about. This is freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of information, the right to privacy. All those sorts of things are sort of embedded in this idea of intellectual freedom, what that means.
Yeah. And so the United Nations goes so far as to include this in their Universal Declaration of Human Rights under Article 19. And here's the quote from this. Everyone has a right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers, end quote. So basically they're saying the people should have the ability to freely speak, to have freedom of press, have freedom of information, have a right to privacy, have right to transparency with government bodies and whatnot. There's a lot to unpack within this.
Yeah. And when we start to see this in action, you may see intellectual freedom in the form of open education resources. Actually, I've liked the fact that I've kind of used this platform to teach a lot of concepts that you would get by attending certain college or high school courses and beyond sometimes, depending on how deep we go. And like, we're kind of free to do that. Like, we can undermine the economic structure that currently guards, if you will, sort of gatekeeps that information and make it freely available. And that's like a thing that we can do.
Yeah.
This also includes things like library systems and open source software. And actually, CRISPR, the thing that people have talked about, the gene editing tool, is essentially open source. Like, anybody could find the information about it if they wanted to, because that's how science sort of worked on that.
Yeah, it's really interesting. But I think there is a question to kind of unpack here, where we have to ask the question of kind of, what does this mean for schools that only want to teach their religious beliefs and want to isolate from other spaces? And essentially, you see this happen a lot in private spaces and private schools. So I think it is important to kind of start talking about that a little bit. Yeah,
this is a good example of where we'd look at, I mean, as we mentioned in here, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and that sort of thing. In our education system, we're sort of guaranteed a certain amount of access to education, right? That's part of it. And so the problem that started arising was, okay, but people maybe don't want to have access to those schools. So then do they have a right to go to a place of education that only teaches what their beliefs, that it's in line with their beliefs, and then that be recognized as legitimate education elsewhere?
Sure.
And they certainly would argue for that. And several people would argue against it, right? And I think another related one, like freedom of speech, is like just coming back to the whole idea. At what point does my freedom to swing my fists around, where is your nose in this metaphor, right? And so it's sort of like, okay, I have the freedom to take my kids out of school. And that means that like my kids, they don't have this right.
Right.
They're just going to do where I put them. Their freedom is non-existent right now. because their rights are, I make choices for them. That choice is they're going to learn what I say that they learn. The parent feels that they should have the right as the parent to make those sorts of choices. And so I think it gets really murky really quickly, because on the one hand, if you were in a government that was only teaching propaganda in their schools, but otherwise gave parents the right to choose how their education for their children went, they might choose to enroll them in a school where the school is not beholden to the government's program and would then teach the kind of values that they want. And so I do understand protecting that freedom to an extent,
right?
But also considering the fact that you're creating potentially a platform where, first of all, the kids don't get a choice in this, right? They're just going to go through it, and they're going to get indoctrinated in whatever system they get indoctrinated in. And the other thing is, like, what does that mean for the people around in that situation,
right?
That are now also going to be subject to that kind of narrow ideological space. And also, what does it mean for people who are in oppressive governments, who, like, that would be their only other access to free information? So complicated.
Yeah, it's really complicated, and I think for schools that's a whole thing. We talked about freedom of speech, and I think we do have to talk about this a little bit.
Yeah,
I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about what freedom of speech really means, especially in the United States. We are fortunate enough that there's a degree that we can express public outcry. We can actively and publicly denounce leaders. Like, we're allowed to do that without some kind of major consequence, as long as what we're saying is not inciting a riot or threats of violence towards somebody.
Right.
Once it becomes a threat of violence, all of a sudden it becomes, it's no longer protected under free speech.
Right.
So, like, I can't walk around and say that I'm going to bring harm to somebody, especially a public figure, without dealing with legal ramifications of that. And that was a big thing that happened with one of the big discussions around Twitter right now. Twitter is a private company. It is not a public forum that is available freely. They can manage their rules. They can manage all the stuff that goes on within that platform, because it is a private organization that is not protected, that does not have to or is required to protect free speech in certain ways. And so there are current policies and procedures in place that prevent people from actively making threats on a platform, especially public figures. And that's why I can think of two specific people off the top of my head that were banned. And they were banned not because of what they were saying, and they weren't trying to suppress their freedom of speech. They were making active threats.
Right.
The former president of the United States and Alex Jones are two people who were forever banned from Twitter because they were actively spreading harmful information on a platform that does not protect free speech. It is not a free speech issue.
To say that was actually an important point. Sort of what you said is, like, Twitter cannot enforce or regulate free speech because they are not a government agency. Twitter, as you said, is a private platform, meaning that what people have done is they have voted to say that private businesses are not subject to the amendments guaranteed in the United States Constitution to a certain degree.
Right.
And freedom of speech is one of them. If a business has an employee who is saying something that business feels is counter to what their message is or what they want their business to be run as, they can make the choice to say that employee, we're not going to support that employee working here, because what they're saying is out of line with our goals, our values, our mission as a company.
Right.
And we have guaranteed them the right to make that choice because they're a private entity. And so when they fire that employee for their information, whatever that information might be, we already gave them the right to make that choice because it is in their best interest as a company to say something like that. And Twitter's the exact same thing.
Yeah.
This is not a free speech platform. None of the social media platforms are.
None of them.
Yeah. And the more recent ones are actually significantly worse than that.
Yeah.
And so the idea that you can just say something anywhere and then, like, someone says, well, this is space that I own. I'm not cool with that kind of message happening in my space, so I'm going to kick you out of it. They have the right to do that.
100%.
Because, again, when we're talking about freedom here and we're talking about freedom with respect to sort of government policies, that person was not incarcerated. They were not fined. They were not jailed. They had no other restrictions in their life. What happened was they violated the policies of a company, and that company cut them off from their services.
100%.
And that is not free speech.
Right. Now, like, the difference would be, and I want to make sure this is really clear. The difference would be if I went on a social media platform and said, my government does not make me happy. I am displeased with the current administration. And then I got arrested for that and was jailed for that. That would be a violation of free speech.
Yes,
because
right.
That is a government stepping in, and they are suppressing a particular speech idea. Now, if I go out and said, I'm going to commit X crime against Y entity, there are laws to protect from situations like that too. There are specific laws. That's not an issue
Right.
of free speech either. That is again in the Constitution, freedom of speech is only protected so far as I'm not causing harm to somebody.
Yeah, or like posting on social media, we're going to go bomb this building. Everyone, like, here's how you do it. Gather me here. Here's like a live stream of us doing these things. And then the cops show up and arrest you on your way.
Yeah.
And like, you're carrying weapons this building. You're claiming you're going to bomb it. Like, we're really clear that like this is not something that you can do. Again, that's not a freedom of speech issue. That is a safety issue, right?
100%.
Yeah, you just can't go around saying those things. Let's take another example. We got libel and slander laws about this. I'm actually glad you decided we're going to lean into this now because it's really important.
Good, yeah.
You can't just say anything about anybody. If you were to go online and start claiming that your neighbor was this whatever, like horrible thing that they were, like something that was like wildly illegal. They were the head of a drug cartel. They were leading a ring of bandits who were breaking into people's houses, whatever you might say. Specifically, this is the example I'm giving in this case is that that's not true, right? This is like, you're just making it up to throw them under the bus and shine a spotlight on them. Doing that is illegal and is not protected by free speech because you are then taking away that person's freedom to sort of go about their normal day.
Right.
They've done nothing. You just don't like them. And so you decided to say these things about them that had people go after them. This is why I think that the people who push conspiracy theories shouldn't have the freedom to do that, because they're often promoting violence against specific people and pinning a target on them and their families.
Mm-hmm.
And again, doing so puts those people in real danger.
I mean, Alex Jones is a perfect example of that.
Yes, exactly. We talked about this in our conspiracy theories episode, again, coming back to that, of the fact that like there are people who have had to like move because they're being targeted by conspiracy theorists who are hunting them around the country, and they just keep having to pick up and move every few months as soon as they're discovered where they're at again. And this is because of the harm caused by people who think that that should be a freedom of theirs, is to send their goons after people. So arguably, based on that, if we were to promote some assassin going after one of these people that we've mentioned, then by their logic, we should be free to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Someone picks up the mantle and they takes a sniper, not our problem.
Right.
You know, that's just a thing that happened, but it kind of is our problem, right? Because we're the ones who promoted that. And that's why I think the freedom to say things ends at when you start taking away other people's freedoms and putting them in real harm.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Great point. I love it.
And I think, I mean, it goes on and on. Like the point at which people will say things like, we're going to talk about this a little bit more later, but they'll say things that are like horrifically offensive and people want to take them to task for it. And they're like, don't say things like that. And they're like, I have freedom to say stuff like that. I'm like, your freedom's not being impinged right now. We're asking you not to say that. Like if you were being fined, jailed, incarcerated, or like losing your job
right
in your current elected position, let's just say this is like an elected official, like then yes, your freedoms were being taken away. But we're just asking you not to say that. I have a right, that one of my freedoms of speech is to ask you to not be a dick, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so like, I totally have a right to ask you not to say that. And you also have a right to say it, but like, I'm asking you not to. And so claiming when someone asks to like, not have you say offensive things is not changing your freedom. And I think this actually really comes around to the people who are getting all hot and bothered about what they might call wokeism. Mm-hmm. When we're like trying to be politically correct and like, could you like not use racial slurs and ableist slurs and ageist slurs and like target all these minority groups? Like, we're just asking that you maybe be more respectful to the people that are like in this country with us.
Right.
You're like, oh, you're suppressing my freedom of speech. I'm like, I'm just asking you. Like, I have not fined you. I have not jailed you. I have not done anything. I'm just asking you to like be nicer.
There's another example I can think of right off the top of my head. There's probably millions of examples that we could think of, but this recently happened in my town where this kid that used to go to like punk shows and stuff, he grew up and he became like this alt-right fanatic, and he became like just somebody that I vehemently disagree with on with every moral fiber of my being.
Wow.
And him and another guy were recently arrested because they were spray painting swastikas and they were putting up swastika stickers up on synagogues and in Jewish neighborhoods. And they were outright, they came out and they said, it's a violation of my free speech. I'm allowed to say what I want. It's like, you can say stuff, But that's not what you got arrested for. You got arrested for vandalism because you're spray painting a church in a protected place. You are vandalizing multiple parts of a neighborhood. Also, it's a hate crime. Like, it is by definition a hate crime. So that's what you got arrested for. You didn't get arrested for saying those things. You got arrested for the specific acts that you did in that space, and you will go to jail for that because you are on camera doing those things. And it was amazing to see how obtuse these people were about this, and like how like ingrained in free speech. It was like it was not a free speech issue at that point in time. It was a specific hate crime issue.
That is a good point. And it does actually raise, like, to make this as balanced as possible, as I'm trying to do, is the point of, like, I think where people maybe get up in arms about this sometimes is they'll like say something. They're like, where does my right to say things end at where it offends people? Right? Like, can I just say something offensive? And that's like, I have rights. Because like, technically anybody could be offended by anything that I say. Mm-hmm. And I think that being offensive is essentially something that's guaranteed by free speech. And I think generally you're not going to get anything for that. Like, you might not be, like, certain businesses might decide that they don't want to have you as an employee, or they don't want you to patronize their business.
Sure.
And they have a right to do that, as we've already claimed. But the government's not going to come after you for offending somebody. So being offensive by itself is not a free speech issue. And I don't think it ever has been, not really, not in this country.
Right.
But I think to your point, where with a swastika, like, I think that is one of those conditions where, like, that makes someone feel unsafe. And that's sort of this offense thing. But that one has like a really clear history of violence behind it. Right.
Right.
Like, if I were to start like painting a symbol that meant nothing, spray painting it, like, I still might get in trouble for vandalism. But if that symbol becomes associated with some like terrorist organization, then like painting that thing is going to have much more serious consequences.
Right.
Because now it has historically meant this is a call to violence against a group of people.
Absolutely. 100%.
Okay. Whew.
Yeah.
Advertisements are to the experience of listening to a podcast what farts are to the experience of riding an elevator. Now, to the podcasters, they are necessary lifeblood. Like, we need to have that in there. And I understand that this is, like riding a smelling elevator, but that's where we find ourselves. So we'll be right back. All right, we are back. This conversation has been so much fun, and I'm really enjoying it. And we have so much more we'd like to talk about, but we don't want this episode to be like, we don't
want it to be a slog.
Yeah. We're not trying to be Spartacus or, Ben-Hur here in terms of Lawrence of Arabia, these 3-hour marathon length movie type episodes. We're going to actually call it here. We weren't originally planning to split this in 2 parts, but we've sort of reached a point at which I think it makes more sense for us to break this into two discussions here, following closely on the heels of our 2-part discussion about atheism. We got stuff to say, man. We got opinions.
Yeah, apparently. Like, this is great. I love it.
All right, so let's quickly hit some take-home points for what we've covered so far. We'll do some recommendations, and then we'll come back with a part 2 to wrap up this discussion next week. Do you want to do some quick take-home points on what we've talked about so far?
So I think my first thing is that freedom is not easily defined.
Yeah.
It is complex, and there are a lot of different kind of nuances to freedom. But I do think it's important to talk about to what degree these freedoms do exist, what kind of freedoms that we do have, and to be able to kind of reflect on those freedoms so that when we go and we start looking at different laws and rules and things that start to infringe on those, I think it's important to be able to know to what degree or what those boundaries are of the freedoms that we have.
Totally. I completely agree with that. And I think one of the big sort of main take homes here is that like it's always this two-way street. And so you've always got to consider what are the implications that are being offered when someone's trying to put into place protections for freedom or right to something, some kind of liberty, right? Mm-hmm. Is that like, okay, like let's be mindful of the fact that like, what are the parameters of the rights that we're guaranteeing?
Right.
Because we didn't even get to really talk about this yet, but like the unrestricted like liberty, like what would that look like? Right. We should talk about that next time.
Right.
But there's going to be parameters to everything of like the freedom to say things ends at where I start advocating for harm that results from those things. My freedom to express myself artistically, like is limited to the point at which I then result in harm. But otherwise, like dissenting opinions, fine.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really important to contrast, what freedoms we do have with circumstances that might be there might be less freedoms than we do have. And I do think that's why it's important to talk about, not necessarily compare and contrast the United States to other people, but to be able to contrast like different policies and examples and stuff like that. We brought up specifically looking at artistic freedom, and we talked about the band Pussy Riot, which is still like one of my favorite band names for like a punk band. It's like so good. But like that example of like artistic freedom and how that becomes like this really scary thing in certain contexts where we in the United States might have the more artistic freedom to say those things. I mean, I think of just going back to that example, like they played a performance at a church to protest an election. And then I think of like NoFX that put out the album War on Errorism, which has a caricature of George Bush on the cover. And they were so outspoken about George W. Bush and had no political ramifications. That is the difference. And it's important to be able to see in contrast how starkly different those circumstances are.
Such a good example. And then I think another one is just that, like, I think when we talk about freedom or lack of freedom, like when what might have otherwise been considered a liberty was being oppressed, there are a lot of people who treat any amount of disagreement as if their freedom then is being restricted. And that's not what that means. And so meaning that, like, if someone asks you to stop doing something, that doesn't impinge on your freedom. If you are kicked out of a private business as a patron or as an employee by violating their policies around speech, that is not an issue of suppressed freedom in those cases. So, like, I think it's important to know what the parameters are and what is and is not considered.
Absolutely. So I don't have any other take-home points from this episode because we still have a lot to unpack and I don't want to spoil it for everybody.
True. It's fair.
I don't know if you have any other ones from this episode, though.
My only take-home point is to recommend some stuff.
Let's do it.
Okay.
Recommendations.
I'm going to recommend this like meal kit delivery service. So essentially it's called Green Chef. And they have all kinds of diet plans. So they've got vegan, vegetarian, paleo, keto, gluten-free, no restrictions, basically no holds barred type services. You can sign up for whichever type that you want. And then for as many meals as you want per week, as servings up to like, I don't know, 6 or 8 or something like that. So if you live in like a 4-person household, you might choose to get 4 servings, 3 meals per week or something like that. Or you might do 5 meals per week, do Monday through Friday. And they basically send you a box that has all of the stuff you need and cooking instructions. And then you just cook it up. And so it's very similar to like Blue Apron and HelloFresh is another one, I guess. There's quite a few out there, tons. But this is one that I feel like I've been able to stick with the longest. And I generally recommend them. And so if you tell them I sent you, then I get a discount. And so you should reach out to me. Let me know so I can give you my discount code.
I'm going to sign up today and I'm going to tell them that Abraham sent me.
Sweet. They're pretty cool. You're paying for these meals. So it's like, I don't remember how much per box. It's probably $30 or something like that. The first time you sign up, you get like a crazy amount off. So maybe if you just want to sign up, do like 1 week of meals for like $20 and you get 6 meals out of it or something, then which is pretty rad considering the quality of the meals. Then go for it. I'm not going to try and stop you. But anyway, Green Chef has been pretty good. So that's what I'm recommending.
Cool. I like it. I'm recommending something that feels like the opposite because at least I think Green Chef feels pretty good. Like it feels like good and healthy and wholesome. And I'm going to recommend a record of a band that I used to listen to when I was a kid that kind of got me into like a certain type of hardcore. And they just put out a new album many, many years later. And this band is called Terror and the album is called Pain into Power. And it is exactly what it sounds like. It is just aggressive and loud and just men screaming over very loud guitars and drums. It's great.
Nice.
So what I really like about this band is like for a long time, like a bunch of like goofy hardcore kids would really like Terror. You know, they had albums like Keepers of the Faith and they're very like, so they're like hardcore is life. Like they had that kind of thing. But this one just feels like a real, like they've been listening to a lot of metal.
Okay. And
the album cover is even just like, it's a demon. Like it's all black and white. And it's a demon coming out of flames and it's like holding a heart in its hands.
Right.
It's like all very cartoony. It's very silly. It is such a great, like to me, a return to form for the Terror that I knew. And they got a bunch of guest vocals. They got, this is why I love metal like so much is because like it's so dorky. Like really, like truly metalheads are very dorky. Like everybody thinks they're cool, but they're not.
Yeah.
The singer of Cannibal Corpse does a guest spot on it. Do you remember what the singer, do you know what his name is?
I know.
What he goes by? He goes by Corpse Grinder. That's his name. So like that's dorky. Like he's not signing checks as Corpse Grinder. Like he's not like it's not on his license as Corpse Grinder. Like that's his nickname. So like, but he's on it. He's on a song called Can't Help But Hate, and it's a lot of fun. So it's just it's a really good hardcore record if you like hardcore. So just go give it a listen if you like that type of thing.
Wowza.
Yeah.
Fun. I dig it.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I also want to say is At the time that this is coming out, we will have just recently passed our 5-year anniversary that we've been doing this podcast. 5 years, which is really fun. And we're really honored that we have been able to do this for so long. We are planning a specific special 5-year anniversary episode that'll be coming out soon. So be on the lookout for that. And that'll hopefully be a lot of fun. But yeah, I just kind of want to acknowledge that we passed by that benchmark. We've celebrated it every year in the past, and I meant to this year, but we just got distracted with all our fun topics and two-parters and things like that. So this is where we're at right now.
Yeah, it's wonderful. It's been a wonderful journey. So thank you for having me on it. It's been great.
Yeah, thank you for joining me on this journey. Thank you all the listeners who have been with us on this journey. We're just going to keep doing what we're doing. And in that episode, we're going to announce we do have some sort of plans for things to shift just a little bit coming up. I'm excited to share those, but I'll wait till we get to the 5-year anniversary official
an update
release.
To format.
Yeah, but right around May 18th, which is before this episode would have come out, was our sort of 5-year anniversary. So it's been cool.
It's been really great because we've gotten to meet a lot of people and connect with a lot of people, and it's been really just a wonderful time.
Yeah. Now, if you would like to see us in our pajamas recording this, you can join us over on Patreon. There you'll get access to videos and uncut, unedited versions of episodes. Depending on the tier you're at, you'll also get access to notes and early release and that sort of thing. So you can join us over on Patreon, be one of the very cool people that help us do this show and get all those cool benefits. If you don't want to do that, you want instead to just wear a jacket that has our name on it, you can do that. You can head over to our merch store at www.podcast.com/store, I think is the link, or if you just go there and then click on the store link or whatever, then you can check out some of our stuff and pick up a mug or a shirt or a hat or a beanie or a water bottle or a sticker. Get lots of stickers. So many stickers.
Yeah. So many stickers. We send them out all the time. So let me know. I'll send you some stuff.
Yeah. Just reach out to us and you might get some stuff for doing so. Those are the financial ways you can support us, but non-financial ways include just rating and reviewing this podcast, where you've listened to podcasts, telling a friend, that sort of thing. Posting about us on social media is helpful. But yeah, you can do that. And then if you just want to talk to us, we love hearing from people, like legitimately do. So reach out to us on social media. You can email us directly at info@wwd.podcast.com and just shout us out. Tell us if what are your thoughts on freedom? What did we get wrong so far? I will say, and I meant to say this earlier in the episode, we reached out on social media to get some thoughts on this and heard the loudest crickets I've ever heard. And so nobody wanted to touch this topic, apparently, on social media at least. So let us know how we did, if you agree or disagree with anything we've said so far, or if you want to recommend a food delivery service or a band that is named after something scary. We'd be happy to share those or at least chat with you about it. Before I say anything else, I need to make sure that I acknowledge those Patreon people I mentioned earlier, which includes Amanda, Brad, The Daily BA, Joshua, Justin, Justine, Kim, Kostia, Layla, Megan, Mike M, Mike T, and Shauna. Thank you, wonderful people, for continuing to support us in what we do. And then thank you to my team, Justin, Selena, Kyle, Alan, Britt, and of course, Shane. Thank you for your notes today and for recording with me.
Yeah, anytime. It's a pleasure to be here.
Indeed. I'm glad that you feel that way, because I certainly do. That is all I have. Am I missing anything?
No, I don't have anything else.
All right, then join us next week for part 2 on this discussion. Otherwise, this is Abraham.
And this is Shane.
We're out.
See ya.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to www.wwdpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.